The never-ending four-stroke progressive engine that could. History is much like an endless waltz. The three beats of war, peace, and revolution continue on forever. Marimaya Kushranada. There is a fascinating idea about everything going in cycles which I find compelling. I have seen a very good Twitter thread about this by, I think, 16th century Baron Scheitposter, who has stated that the Protestant religious revivals in the United States have historically gone about every 60 years. And this has been confirmed by people in our circles, such as Radical Liberation, who stated that revivals seem to occur every 30 years. This initially seems to be a good idea, and lines up nicely if you do the math and extrapolate the various Great Awakenings and religious revivals up until the present time. Furthermore, if you consider the popular proposition on the dissident right that progressivism is Protestantism, or at least is derived from it, then deciphering how this cycle works is extremely useful. Other thinkers, such as de Maistre, spoke about the quality that the French Revolution had, and how it seemed to him as a force of nature. I assert that qualitatively, the left is fluid and the right is concrete. The left are the flood and the swarm. My observation on this historical cycle is that it can be broken down into two 30-year periods. The first period I call the foundation. In this period, the initial moral and intellectual structure is founded for the rest of the cycle. It can also be characterized as the infiltration stage. In other words, all the groundwork and initial infiltration and penetration is performed at this stage. The second period I call the closing. This period takes all of the intellectual and moral frameworks from both the previous period and the preceding cycle, and takes to its logical conclusion and most extreme point. It also sets the stage and many of the boundaries for the genesis of the next progressive cycle. So, in essence, this cycle acts like a fluid which is pumped through. Input, output. This brings us to a recent observation that I have had in my reading of Alain de Benoit's On Being a Pagan. In it, he identifies the theological underpinnings of paganism as well as Judaism and Christianity. A fascinating insight that he makes is that in Christianity and Judaism, the world is a cryptogram to be deciphered, which operates as diastole and systole. Diastole, of course, meaning the phase in which the heart muscle relaxes and the chambers fill with blood. Systole, meaning the phase of the heartbeat in which the heart contracts and blood pumps from the chambers to the arteries. The analogy of a heart is an apt one, and as you can see, this is the little progressive engine that could. This is the engine which couples to and shunts the bio-Leninists' scum and drags them around with it. Of course, trucks are scum. They will be shunted. Input, output. If the great progressive pump is like a steam engine, this mechanical process brings many questions. How does one stop a pump, or indeed, a heart? There are three options. The first is that you don't stop the pump, but rather channel the output and the flow and divert it. This is the obvious problem that if the river is wide enough, deep enough, or has a strong and swift current, that civil engineering project will be very difficult, time-consuming, and there is no guarantee that on occasion the watery lifeblood of the progressive heart will not force its way out of the channel and the floodgates which you have laid for it. This seems to me to be the conservative strategy, which is always defensive in nature, and always ends up not building the levees high enough. When the levee breaks, they have no place to stay. They stand athwart the railroad tracks of history, yelling hysterically, "Stop!" and are promptly turned into human pancakes by the progressive tank engine. The second is the option of piercing the heart, and thus destroying it. This was the option attempted in the middle of the 20th century, and it was effective at the local or national level. There are many problems with this option. Firstly, is that it is very messy. Should you pierce the heart, rapid depressurization begins. The blood spills everywhere and contaminates everything in a 10-yard radius. Once input has been given, the progressive engine is pressurized. It will not simply leak its fluid onto the floor. it will explode. Second is that the timing of the middle of the 20th century was wrong from my perspective. It made its assault on this progressive engine at the conclusion of the foundational stage, right when this cycle was transforming itself into its closing. The mid-century reactionaries struck at the height of the early 20th century progressive movement, after all the intellectual work and the initial infiltration into the institutions had been completed. This was an attempt to prevent output. To attack at such a time is to assault when the heart has drawn its breath and has enough fuel to resist. It requires enough force to overcome that fuel, exhaust the defensive mechanisms, and strike the decisive blow. Such attempts require overwhelming force, and without which they are doomed to fail. The third option is the best option. Instead of preventing or diverting output, it attempts to prevent input. It is the option which makes its attack when the heart has just exhaled, and thus lacks fuel. Perhaps you could pierce the heart here, but I prefer a different approach. Instead of piercing the heart engine, you choke it. It has not yet drawn its breath, and therefore will have less resources, less oxygen to resist you. Extinguishing of the spark within that fiery coal box of the progressive engine will come swifter. Of course, putting out a fire requires you to collapse one of the arms of the fire tetrahedron. A plentiful oxygen supply is one of the 4 things required to start a fire. Therefore, the timing of this attack could not be more fortuitous. It is at the ending of the old cycle and the beginning of the new cycle. By observable reality, the modern left has exhausted itself intellectually and morally. It is currently, in 2022, at that conclusion and is attempting a new beginning. We must find a way to choke it and prevent it from recycling once more. For if I am correct, and we fail now, then we will have to wait another full cycle before there will be another chance to kill it. To test my theory, I would like to very quickly go through history, starting with the modern period circa the 2020s. I perceive that the 2020s are the closing of the current cycle, and therefore also the beginning of the next cycle. Be aware that I am playing fast and loose with time and space here, but I want to give the viewer the general flavor of each era and how clockwork the progressive engine seems to have been throughout history. I recognize that some events in Europe might seem like they are out of step with the cycle, but I think that they are really the same cycle, just with the foundation and closing phases, one phase out of sync with the US. So when you have the closing of a cycle in Europe with the Bolshevik regime in Russia, the foundation of the progressive movement in the US is being set. So it operates like a 4-stroke engine. How fitting for Faustian civilization to operate so mechanically. Furthermore, we must make allowance for periods of transition. The period of transition from a non-Bolshevik world to a Bolshevik one took time. Furthermore, one could make the argument that the FDR regime synchronized the cycles between Europe and the United States, and it took around 10 to 15 years to do this. I submit also that since history now seems to move faster, the farther back one goes, the more that the cycles will be somewhat more or less than the 30 to 60 year cycles. It certainly appears that different issues, like abortion or temperance, are slightly out of sync with each other, and these issue differences in timing are most prominent in the 19th century. Furthermore, it appears that these things have a corresponding cycle of warfare as well, with conflicts beginning at the beginning of the foundational cycle, World War I, the Napoleonic era, and during the beginning of the closing cycle, World War II, the American Civil War. Obviously, in some cases, ideas do not spread through simple transmission. They are spread through warfare. The Napoleonic era is unique in that it seems to have spread solely through warfare, and by doing so did not have a second phase of warfare as in the 30 Years' War and in the World War I, World War II era. Also, another observation is that the first war is smaller in scale than the second in the cycle. So it must have the effect of opening up a crack which can be exploited later during the larger conflict in the second half of the cycle. So Allow me briefly to go through the historical timeline. In the 2020s, you have wokeism. Leading up to that, starting in the 1990s, you have the beginnings of political correctness and the solidification of human resources regime. From the 1960s to the 1990s, you have the exhaustion, discrediting of the communist regime in Western intellectual circles. This is the beginning of postmodernism, as well as the Black liberation, gay liberation, and women's liberation movements. The foundation is set for intersectional politics. From the early 1900s to the 1960s is the communism and economic progressive cycle. In the US, you have the first 30 years from 1900 roughly to the 1930s, which represents the foundation phase, culminating in the election of FDR to the presidency. This period is represented by labor unions, strikes, trust busting, prohibition, and ultimately leads into, like I said, to the FDR administration in the early 30s. The period from the FDR administration to the 1960s, from circa 1930 to 1960, is the closing of the economic progressivism cycle. This period is characterized by the defeat of Nazi Germany and the solidification of the Boomer Truth regime. The period from 1840 to 1900 is the cycle of the American Civil War and the 1848 revolutions in Europe. Also, it is the period of the Third Protestant Great Awakening and proto-progressive movements, which are tangentially related, such as the temperance movement. The foundation, beginning in the 1840s to the 1870s, characterized by abolitionism, American Civil War, Reconstruction, and the beginnings of Marxist thought. The closing of this era is roughly 1870 to 1900. You have the beginnings of labor unions, the temperance movement, etc. The cycle from the 1780s to the 1840s represents the Napoleonic revolutionary period. 1780 to roughly 1810 is the period of French Enlightenment, Revolution, and Napoleonic Wars. Intellectual works which define this cycle and the cycle of the Second Protestant Great Awakening are Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. The United States Constitution was also ratified during this period. This time represents the beginning of the fall of the Ancien regime and aristocracy in Europe, and also the establishment of the First French Republic in 1792. However, the ending of the foundational cycle here, specifically in 1810, is auspicious, as Bonaparte is at the height of his power. In 1810, he has just won his last victorious campaign at Wagram the year before. After 1810, he is a man who is out of step with time, and therefore had increasing difficulty in winning military victories on the field of battle. Now, the period from roughly 1800 to 1840 is the time period of the Second Protestant Great Awakening and the emergence of the first elements of the abolitionist movement. Also, this is the time of Hegel, who influenced Marxist thought. This is the beginning of the emerging entrepreneurial capitalist system and the exchanging of the old aristocracy in favor of the entrepreneurial capitalist elites, especially in the Anglophonic world. The cycle of 1720 to 1780 is the time of high enlightenment. From 1720 to 1750, the First Great Awakening begins in Britain and North America in the 1730s and 40s. And of course, in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie is defeated at Culloden, and the French and Indian War concludes in roughly, I believe, 1757. Now, from 1750 to 1780, like I said, you have the conclusion of the French and Indian and 7 Years' War, but you also have the American War of Independence from 1776 to 1781. And of course, Rousseau himself publishes The Social Contract in 1762. From 1660 to 1720, this cycle is the Glorious Revolution. From 1660 to 1690, you obviously have the restoration of Charles II in England, and Locke publishes the Second Treatise on Government in 1689. In the 1689, you also have the Glorious Revolution and the final solidification of a Protestant monarch on the throne of Britain. The Spanish decline after the War of the Spanish Succession, and also the beginning of Jacobite rebellions. It is also the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain. The Jacobites defeated in 1719, the defeat of Spain in the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Also, the Act of Union passed in 1720. In 1600 to 1660, you have continuing Protestant versus Catholic conflict in the 30 Years' War from 1600 to 1630. The first segment of this conflict was in Bohemia in 1618 to 1620, which is the first phase of the 30 Years' War. You have things like pamphlet wars, religious tension, anti-hierarchical social conflicts in the British Isles going into the Bishops' Wars. From 1630 to 1660, you have the Bishops' Wars, the English Civil War, the regicide of the English monarch Charles I, the normalization of the Puritan regime until the restoration of Charles II in 1660, which represents the beginning of the next time cycle. And the Treaty of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War in 1648. 1540 to 1600. From 1540 to 1570, continuing wars of religion, the breakout of rebellions and wars in places outside of Bohemia and Germany. Continuing spread of Protestantism, the breakaway of Henry VIII of England from the Catholic Church. John Calvin becomes minister in Strasbourg in 1538. Calvinism is declared the official religion in Navarre by Jean d'Albret in 1560. This is a foundational phase. The closing phase here is from 1570 to 1600. This is the Elizabethan era in England. You have the Anglo-Spanish War in 1585 to 1604. It is also the beginning of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands in 1568. You also have the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. The Edict of Nantes is published in 1598, which, very close to the year of 1600, ends the first cycle of the French Wars of Religion, or rather, ending the French Wars of Religion. From 1480 to 1540, the opening phase from 1480 to 1510, the printed book is universal in Europe by 1480. You have the following spread of ideas, and the Bible printed and available widely in the vernacular language. Also, the commercial viability of the printing press is established, thus ensuring that the Bible in the vernacular is widely available to the populace. You'll see why this is important in a second. From 1510 to 1540, this is the closing phase. Luther posts his 95 Theses. The Protestant Reformation begins. Also, the Wars of Reformation begin, as well as the Anabaptist peasant revolts. So, like we've mentioned before, you have the opening phase with a new technology allowing the spread of new ideas to people that were either unable to access them or just simply the creation of new ideas. And then you have the closing phase where these ideas begin to get put into practice, and the natural, social, and economic and actual physical conflicts that result. This is a very good example of this. To take it even further back, 1420 to 1480. The opening cycle here, 1420 to 1450, you have the preaching and ultimate execution of Jan Hus in 1415. The Hussite rebellion begins in 1419 and has warfare until 1434. Obviously, the Hussites were noted for their utilization of wagons and firearms, thus negating the advantage of the aristocratic medieval armored knight. And as well as this, you have the continuing infantry revolution from the preceding century. This foundational period represents the spread of Hussite heresy and the compromise with moderate Hussites by the Catholic Church in order to defeat radical Hussites. And of course, the closing phase is 1450 to 1480, where Gutenberg invents the printing press in 1455. And this area also has the first printed Bible. In 1360 to 1420, this cycle begins with the foundational phase of 1360 to 1390. The foundational is represented by the 1359, the first graduate of the University of Prague. The translation of the entire Bible into Czech by the mid-14th century. Atmosphere in Bohemia, generally speaking, against the Pope, and indulgences. Jan Hus attends the University of Prague, where he is taught by an anti-papal faculty. For those who have been in any circle of the last decade, just a question, where have we seen this before? From 1390 to 1420, this is the closing phase. Jan Hus preaches, he is caught, executed for heresy, which culminates in the Hussite rebellion in 1415. I will leave this here for now. This is intended to be a basic skeleton of what I'm talking about. As we know from Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, the Hussites influenced many others, despite being ultimately defeated. If anyone wants to extrapolate this pattern further, please do so. The three beats of war, peace, and revolution echo for eternity. Are these the footsteps of God, or are they the doom engine? Lastly, a word on Agenda 2020 or 2030 if you prefer. Globalists intuitively know this cycle. Nixon, Trump, and arguably Charles II, due to timing rather than their own personal talents, are threats to this progressive cycle. Regardless of how effective they had to be destroyed due to the fact that they might possibly shatter the cycle and thereby interrupt the metastasizing of a new foundational phase. Our enemies know this. If you liked this video, please like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and be sure to check out findmyfriends.net to follow me in all of the places where I am present online, including my Substack account, where I am very prolific in writing. Thank you.